I just tried the new Taiwanese Oolong sampler from Jesse's Tea House, and I'll be sharing my thoughts on each of the teas. This tea sampler includes 4 different Taiwanese Oolong teas that Jesse found during his trip to Taiwan, and I wanted to take the time to try each one of them and jot down my thoughts. First, let's take a brief look at the Taiwanese Oolong box itself. I really like the patterns on this box, and it made the sampler look like a watercolor painting come to life. Once you open up the Taiwanese Oolong sampler, you'll notice 4 different types of Taiwanese Oolong tea inside, a note from Jesse himself, and a brewing guide for the Oolong. Oolong is a partially oxidized tea, making it somewhere in between a green tea, or unoxidized tea, and a black tea, or fully oxidized tea. It typically is made from the older leaves of the tea plant, and it's either tightly rolled into ball shapes or rolled a little bit more loosely into strip shapes. First, I wanted to taste the Alishan Jinxuan or Milk Oolong. This Taiwanese Oolong comes from the Jin Xuan cultivar and is more famously known as Milk Oolong. It's a common misconception that this tea contains actual milk products in it. The reason it gets the name Milk Oolong is because of the smooth and naturally creamy flavor, which comes from the Jin Xuan cultivar used to make the tea. The tea is produced in the Alishan mountain region of Taiwan, which is probably the most well-known tea-producing regions in Taiwan. This is why you often see Alishan Oolong or High Mountain Oolong in the name of the tea. Although I have very little experience with Taiwanese Oolongs, Jin Xuan Oolong is probably the one I'm most familiar with, as I've tried about a dozen different kinds. What I like to look for in a Jin Xuan Oolong is not only this smooth, milky oolong flavor, but also a perfumey floral aroma when I drink and smell the tea. This is a lightly oxidized oolong, so it tends to have more fresh and floral characteristics. The floral aromas don't come from adding flowers to the leaves or even by scenting the leaves with flowers, they are actually from the leaves themselves. As the oolong is being produced, a producer will bruise the tea leaves, which brings certain enzymes to the surface of the leaf to be exposed to the air. This means the oxidation process is accelerated, and then later it's slowed down by applying heat. If you watch our videos on Japanese green teas, you'll know that in order to make them, the heat is applied almost immediately after the harvest. This locks in the more grassy or vegetal characteristics of the leaf, and it's why sencha has such a strong steamed vegetable flavor and green color. In Japan, they also make a Japanese oolong, although it's quite rare. It's made using a similar production method to the Taiwanese oolongs like the Jin Xuan, and we found a great producer in southern Japan that makes a fantastic oolong tea. This tea is quite similar in flavor to the Jin Xuan oolong, with strong floral aromas and a smooth, creamy finish. If you want to try it, you can find it on our website, neoteas.com. But let's get back to the Jin Xuan Oolong. When we open this tea up, the first thing you'll notice is that the leaves are very tightly rolled into these ball shapes. This is important to notice for 2 reasons. First of all, it means that the tea will be very dense, and instead of just guessing the amount of leaves, you may want to get a digital scale to weigh it out, especially if you're new to the tea type like I am. The second thing to keep in mind is that these leaves will take a while to expand, but once they do expand, they will be much larger. Make sure not to overpack your teapot, otherwise towards the end of the session, you won't have any room left for water. You'll also want to take the tea for multiple infusions because it will slowly release the flavor over time as the leaves expand. So let's learn how to brew oolong tea. If we take a look at this guide that Jesse made, we see the perfect temperature, leaf to water ratio, and brewing time for each of the Taiwanese oolongs. I'll be starting with 6 grams of the Jin Xuan Oolong, measured out in a clay teapot with a digital scale. For Taiwanese oolongs, it's recommended to give the tea a quick rinse for 5 seconds to prepare the leaves for infusion. After the 5-second rinse, you can open the lid back up and get an aroma of the wet leaves. Almost instantly, my nose was flooded with lilac, letting me know that this was going to be a great infusion. For Jin Xuan Oolong, it's recommended to use 95 degrees Celsius water and an initial steeping time of 45 seconds. One thing I like about this brewing guide is that it includes a ratio of leaf to water. So if I'm using 6 grams of leaves, I know I'm going to need 150 milliliters of water. After 45 seconds, I poured out the tea and gave it a quick taste. My first thoughts were that the tea was really strong in these lilac notes, with a pleasant sweetness and a milkiness in the finish. The aftertaste of this tea also had a milkiness to it. The second infusion was 40 seconds, and I felt the tea beginning to drift into a different direction. The Jin Xuan started to lose a little bit of its trademark floral taste, and it started to take on a hint of savoriness, tartness, and vegetal flavor, almost like a green tea. This made the tea a little bit more familiar to me, as I'm normally drinking green teas all day. The second steeping of the Alishan Oolong maintained its milky finish, which was a strong signal for me. The third brewing of the Milk Oolong was for 50 seconds, and I found the lilac and sweetness returned, and the tea began to pick up some minerality. It was really cool watching this tea evolve over time as each infusion had its own strengths. This tea reminded me a lot of the Japanese oolong, but I found it was much more young and bright, whereas the Japanese oolong seems a bit more mature and mellow. The tasting notes are definitely similar, with notes of honeysuckle, milk, and lilac. Now that we've showed you how to brew oolong tea with Jinxuan, let's quickly go through the other 3 oolongs in this Taiwanese oolong sampler. So next we have the twice roasted High Mountain Oolong Tea. This tea is also a Taiwanese oolong, but this time it's from the Dalun Mountains. Rather than the green leaves we saw before on the Jin Xuan Oolong, this one is roasted, so it's much darker in color. I thought it would be helpful to compare to another oolong in this box, which is the 5-time roasted Dong Ding Oolong Tea. This Dong Ding Oolong is roasted over charcoal 5 times instead of 2 times. And as a result, the leaves take on this almost black color, and the liquor becomes much darker as well. So the first brewing of the 2-time roasted oolong was mineral-rich, buttery, and nutty, with a hint of sweetness. The roasted flavor or char intensified in the later brewings of the tea, but it maintained a smooth creaminess in the finish throughout. The Dong Ding Oolong Tea, on the other hand, had much darker flavors, presumably from the extra 3 roasting stages. The sour and fruity flavors you normally get in a tea had disappeared to leave space for a strong minerality and a slightly charred cigar note. It's really important to note that while the Dong Ding Oolong drifted into these really heavy roasted directions, there was a returning sweetness or sweet aftertaste throughout. The Dong Ding Oolong was also the most consistent of the 4 teas and kept a similar flavor from brewing to brewing. In the 4th infusion, I really noticed the coffee flavors coming through. Finally, the 4th tea in our Taiwanese sampler box was the Lu Yi Red Oolong. Red Oolong is a relatively new style of Taiwanese oolong, and it combines the flavors of a oolong tea with the flavors of a black tea or red tea. After the first sip of the Red Oolong, I had already selected my favorite of the Taiwanese oolongs. This Red Oolong combined a lot of what I like in oolong teas with my favorite elements of red teas. First, you get a strong minerality and a hint of char, but it later evolves into a fruitiness with notes of tangerine and peach. I felt like the red tea was trying to peek through the more charred notes of the oolong, which was really cool. The 2nd and 3rd brewings of this tea showed a little less of this fruitiness as the nutty and roasted notes of the oolong began to dominate. The Red Oolong still maintained this brown sugar sweetness and chocolatey flavor profiles, which is likely due to the higher oxidation. Before we get to my final rankings of the Taiwanese oolong teas, I wanted to give my thoughts on the sampler in general. I loved this adventure through Taiwanese oolong teas, and as a beginner myself, I felt I had learned a lot by sampling the teas all at once. In general, we're big fans of sampling a lot of different teas because tea is such a personal thing and you'll never know which one is your favorite until you've tried them all. That's why we put together our Japanese tea sampler, which includes all the best teas we found during our travels around Japan, which you can find at neoteas.com. I think Jesse's tea sampler does a similar thing for Taiwanese oolongs, and if you want to try it yourself, we'll put a link in the description. The quality of the teas is great, and the educational materials included in the sampler makes the drinking experience even better. Whether you're new to Taiwanese oolong teas or you just want to learn a little bit more, I would recommend you try the sampler and taste along with them on the YouTube channel. While all these teas were great, my favorites were the Red Oolong at number 1, the Jin Xuan Oolong at number 2, the 2-times charcoal roasted oolong at number 3, and the Dong Ding Oolong at number 4. After doing this sample, I really felt like I learned a lot about the roasting process and how it impacts the flavor from the unroasted Jinxuan to the heavily roasted Dong Ding Oolong. I wish you all the best of luck on your journey through Japanese green tea and Taiwanese oolong. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.